Hi, everyone. Welcome to Forbes Talks. I'm Diane Brady, Assistant Managing Editor here at Forbes. I'm with Emily Baker-White, my colleague in San Francisco, who's been covering ByteDance for quite some time now. Emily, what's the latest that you found?
So today we published a piece about a fraud risk assessment, a sort of type of internal audit that large companies conduct from time to time, that was conducted by ByteDance in 2021. Now, ByteDance, of course, is TikTok's parent company, and millions and millions of Americans turn to TikTok every day for their entertainment, increasingly for their news. Some people are even sort of using TikTok the way that we've used Google in the past, right? So this fraud risk assessment by ByteDance showed that ByteDance and TikTok are not able to be sure that the information they turn over to governments is accurate and complete. And this is extra important in the context of TikTok because TikTok is right now negotiating a national security contract with the US government.
So can we step back a second? I want to ask about ByteDance because the way that they portray the relationship with TikTok is different than what you found through your reporting. So just remind us, you said, of course, it's the parent, it's based in China, so that always causes concerns. But how did it first get on your radar as something worth covering?
So I first started covering TikTok before I started covering ByteDance. And what I learned very quickly was that the relationship between TikTok and ByteDance internally is a lot more porous than the companies make it seem in the public eye. And so when you join TikTok as an employee, you get a ByteDance email address, and your TikTok email address is actually just an alias of that ByteDance email address. I've had TikTok employees tell me that they signed a contract to work for TikTok, but their W-2 said ByteDance on it. And so I think what we're seeing here is ByteDance is an enormous company. It's been around for much longer than TikTok's been around. And they've made tons of apps. They've made dozens of apps, even apps that have been present in the United States market before. And to ByteDance, at least initially, TikTok was just another app they made. And more recently, because TikTok became a smash hit in the United States and because regulators started getting really concerned about the potential national security issues of having a Chinese-owned app have this much control, TikTok spun off and became its own company. But all of the internal systems that make TikTok work, all of the sort of back-end tools that engineers and product managers are using to make sure that the app is running, were made by ByteDance and were made in China. And trying to disentangle all of those things is really hard. And so to this day, my understanding is that a lot of what makes TikTok run is actually ByteDance in China. And I wrote a big report on this earlier this year. TikTok and ByteDance are actually trying to disentangle their backend systems. They call it something called Project Texas. But that has been a lot more difficult to do than they initially thought. Imagine a pile of spaghetti, right? And you have to disentangle the spaghetti just in order to sort of separate the data flows between the companies.
And they're separating it in order to not run afoul of regulators. You mentioned the regulators in Washington. I know that there has been legislation. I know people are calling it digital fentanyl, TikTok in particular for kids. Is the issue that we associate anything in China with Chinese government, ergo spying, and all kinds of nefarious implications of cybersecurity risk? Is that really what's going on here?
So obviously ByteDance is not the same thing as the Chinese government. Chinese companies do have to comply with Chinese laws that say they have to turn over information if the government asks, or sort of upon request. Now, TikTok says it's never shared information with the Chinese government, nor would it. ByteDance, interestingly, hasn't answered that question. And ByteDance does a lot of business in China. They have a Chinese version of TikTok called Douyin, right? They have another very popular news aggregator app in China called Toutiao. And obviously, their Chinese apps run differently and have different rules than their international apps do. But I think one of the big questions here is whether either implicitly or explicitly the Chinese government could either ask ByteDance or through ByteDance collect a bunch of information about US citizens or dissidents, people who are critical of the Chinese government, et cetera, or whether they could use the massive power of TikTok's recommendations algorithm to subtly affect what United States citizens are seeing. And that first concern, which some commentators call data espionage, is the one that has, I think, gotten the most attention in Washington so far. That is the problem they are trying to mitigate through this Project Texas exercise. But I think the other potential for influence is important too. And that's that very subtly, ByteDance could and TikTok could change their algorithm to influence what Americans or Europeans or Australians or anyone is consuming. And frankly, that's a concern that we've had about Facebook before. It's a concern we've had about Twitter. They're having about Twitter right now.
I mean, it sounds like a concern writ large about the social media platforms too. But let me get back to the fraud risk assessment in particular, because I presume, first of all, that this is not the kind of thing that companies do and then hand out to reporters. Am I correct?
Not.
So
they do not.
So why was this important in terms of, first of all, they did this risk assessment in response to, I presume, the questions. Take us back a little bit to when this assessment was done. And what struck you, having covered the company for so long, what it is that really stood out to you as different or new pieces of information that make us smarter about the company and its relationships?
So this was a really meticulous document. It represented a lot of work, probably months of work. It was based on approximately 90 interviews with TikTok and ByteDance employees and a review of a bunch of other TikTok and ByteDance documents. And my understanding was the people who were creating this report sort of went out into the company. They were internal to the company, but they went across, I think, at least 17 teams to try to learn as much as they could about the company's current practices and procedures and where there might be gaps and where there might be risks, right? Mm-hmm. And what those folks found was there were a number of sort of irregularities in the typical fraud risk areas, things like embezzlement, employees taking kickbacks to do favors for external folks, people contracting with, their brother-in-law.
That's all outlined in the report, the embezzlement.
That's all outlined in the report. And I have to say, that's somewhat normal for any company of ByteDance's size. Companies should be thinking about how employees might be abusing their systems. At one point, the fraud risk assessment said there are two kinds of companies that know there's fraud in their organizations and companies that don't, right? And so I think the most large companies do fraud risk assessments. All large companies should be doing fraud risk assessments. And doing one is actually a sign of diligence, right? Because if you're not doing one, you're just not identifying the problems. But this fraud risk assessment also highlighted a number of risks that were not just about employee embezzlement and sort of regular fraud issues, and that were more specifically about the fact that the company had been built out in and was housing data in China. And so I think those are the risks that made this report different. Also, the sort of normal type of fraud risks, it really sounds like ByteDance is behind or was behind when this report was written, behind other companies of its size.